Hello, friends. Well, today we're taking a look at Hebrews chapter 6, verses 9 through 20. And I want to break this up into a couple of sections. First of all, we're in chapter 6, verses 9 through 12, and here our author is offering a word of encouragement. And notice how quickly he changed his tone in verse 9. He is assuring his readers here that he does not consider them apostates. He says, I have greater confidence in you than that. Now, that terrible condition is a potential one for them, as well as any believer. But for the present, the author assures his readers that he has confidence in them. And this confidence is based upon two things, right? It's based first upon their work and what they had done. That's interesting, isn't it? What had they done? He says in this verse that they had shown love for God's sake in serving the saints. I have this confidence in you because I've seen how you act. I've seen your works. They're good works. They're works that demonstrate your love for God. And that tells me that your hearts are right. I know I'm adding here and paraphrasing a little bit, but I think it's interesting that his confidence in them is first of all based upon what they have done. But secondly, it's based upon God's character. The author knows that God is just, that God will not forget what they have done in his name. Well, it would be unfair of him to do so, right? And God cannot be unfair. He is fairness and justice personified. And I really like this thought too. The author is saying, I think better things of you because I know that God is just. I know the character of God, and I know that he will not punish you when you're not deserving of it. I like that. Well, what the author wants to do in these verses is to encourage his readers to cling to their hope at all costs. It's a hope, he says, which must be sustained firm to the end. It is through patience and faith, he says, that they will inherit the promises. They cannot afford then to become sluggish and lazy in their faith. That's verses 9 through 12. It's an appeal for them to hold on to their faith, to hold on to their hope, to not become sluggish. Then, in verses 13 through 19, our author wants to remind his readers of the certainty of God's promises. His promises are sure and unbreakable, and therefore they provide a solid foundation for hope. What does the author do to prove his point? He appeals to an occasion in the life of Abraham. God made a promise to Abraham that he would bless him and multiply his seed. And how did Abraham respond? He patiently endured. And the writer says, by doing so, he obtained the promise. God confirmed that promise with an oath. Now, for God, taking an oath to back up his word would seem wholly unnecessary. But since with men oaths are important, God condescended and made himself his own witness. God's promise is sure. It is solid and irrevocable. His mere word is enough. But God, wishing to make human beings feel doubly sure, makes himself the witness and the guarantee of his own word. So, God certified his promise with an oath, and there are two things God cannot do. He cannot break his promise, and he cannot take an oath falsely. If either his promise or his oath proved false, the very nature of his being would be violated, and he would cease to be God. All of this is to say that we can trust God to keep his word and to keep his promises. Now, in verse 19, you notice that he mentions again this word hope. It's a word that has come up several times earlier in the book of Hebrews. And in verse 19, our author states that hope is to the believer what an anchor is to a ship. It holds us, it sustains us, it braces us in the midst of all of our trials. Hope is the anchor of the soul, our author says, and it's the anchor that gives us stability. Then he mentions a word about Jesus. He says Jesus has gone into heaven itself, into the Holy of Holies. Do you think he's writing to a Jewish audience here who are familiar with the tabernacle and the temple and the Holy of Holies, and how the high priest went into that Holy of Holies once a year, one day out of the year? And the writer says Jesus himself went into the holiest of holies, the holiest place. He went into God's very presence. He went into heaven itself, and he's our forerunner, the author says. He is our scout, our leader who has gone before us. As a result, we will surely follow in his steps. Jesus' entrance behind the curtain is the pledge that his followers too will come into the holiest place of all, into the very presence of God. With that, our author returns to the subject he wanted to discuss in chapter 5 and verse 10, how Jesus became a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. It seems to be very important to his argument in Hebrews, doesn't it? I think for the next 3 chapters he's going to talk about the high priesthood of Jesus and how he is a high priest not after the Aaronic order, but after the Melchizedekan order. Okay. Now, just a word about application, although we've been talking about application all through this. Let's get a bird's eye view of where we have been since Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 11, where the author wanted to talk about the high priesthood of Jesus after the order of Melchizedek, but he couldn't talk about it. And why? Well, because he says you have become dull in understanding. Since 5 chapter 11, it is imperative that we make progress in our spiritual growth. There's the application. We can't afford to be sluggish and lazy. We can't afford to coast, because our author says that to fail to make progress is to risk what? The possibility of falling away from God entirely. And what we need to do to keep from falling off the precipice, our author has brought us to the precipice, where we look over the edge and we see what can happen to us if we don't make progress. How dismal our future could become if we don't make progress. What do we need to do to keep from falling off of that precipice? We need to hold on to our hope at all costs. If we hold on and maintain our hope of eternal life, we will be like an anchored ship that calmly rides the waves. We will be able to weather any storm, any set of adverse circumstances. And life has a way of giving us and sending us those adverse circumstances, wouldn't you say? But our author says that if we'll just hold on to our hope, we'll hold on to our faith in Jesus, we'll be able to ride out any storm, because we'll have an anchor of the soul, and that anchor is our hope. Okay. Well, I think that's all I have for you today. We'll start talking more about the Melchizedekan priesthood in chapter 6, chapter 7. Yeah, we're ready for chapter 7 already, aren't we? Well, I'm really enjoying this study of Hebrews, and I'm so glad that you are with us in this study. And may God bless you in the coming week.